I think most business owners and most people who are decision makers in businesses know that strategy is important, but I don't necessarily know if they or think they know exactly what it means. So could you tell us a little bit about what exactly strategy is?
Yeah, so first off, I would totally agree with that point. I think everybody knows, yeah, I mean, you're supposed to be good at strategy. But I think if you pressed them, well, what I would also say too is I think if you asked a lot of people, like, so are you a good strategist? A lot of people who find themselves in positions where they are making a decision in a business, or they've started a business, or they own or operate a business, they think, at least in the area of their expertise, I think most people tend to think of themselves as good strategists. But I don't know if you've ever seen this statistic before, but like something like 80% of Americans report that, no, it's more than that. I think it's in the 90s maybe. But when asked, are you above average or below average intelligence, it's like 90% of people say, yep, I'm above average, which is kind of funny. I think this is similar. If you ask most people, like, are you like doing strategy well in your business? Maybe not in every aspect of life, but in your business, a lot of people are like, yep, I think I am. But what I would argue is that a lot of people confuse strategy with tactics. So I'll try to describe what I mean by that a little bit. But one like really famous and really good quote is from Sun Tzu, the guy that wrote The Art of War. So he said um, that strategy without tactics is the slowest path to victory, and tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. And that doesn't necessarily give you a definition of the two, but it gives you kind of the practical outcome of confusing the two. So tactics are like what you do to win a battle. Strategy is what you do to win a war. And I think if you think about that in terms of like parenting, if you have like a toddler that's throwing a fit, you can make the fit end quickly if you give them what they want. But if your goal is to raise a well-rounded, respectful, self-possessed adult who's fun to be around, then you might not just give that toddler what they want if you can keep your eye on that longer-term goal. That longer-term goal is the strategic goal. Ending the fit is the tactical goal. So that's a good way to think about the difference between tactics and strategy. And one, well, yeah, I think that's probably like, I'd say that's probably like a good way to think of it. And that toddler example is maybe about as good of one as you could come up with, is to think about, what's the bigger picture, longer range objective. And then there's almost always shorter term things that you need to accomplish that are incremental steps that you take towards that longer term goal. But then trying to kind of like have a sense in which the way that you go about accomplishing those smaller intermediate step goals, such that it keeps you pointed in the direction of that long-term strategic goal. That's kind of like what it means to be a strategic thinker. It's kind of like keeping your eye on the ball, having a sense of keeping the ship pointed in the right direction, even whenever the destination is all the way over the horizon line. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. And could you potentially give us one or two tips that could help us stay focused on what's strategically important and how to avoid getting sucked into tactical stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. And part of why I think it's good to kind of maybe have some of those like mental shortcuts that you can kind of just hold in your brain is because it is surprisingly confusing and tempting to get drugged back down into tactical stuff. And I think this is particularly true if you are someone who got into your business because you started off as an operator. So like let's say for example that you're a carpenter and you now own a carpentry business, but you started life just doing carpentry for somebody else. And maybe you had a moment when you were like, I'm pretty good at this. I think people would hire me even if I didn't, have this other person's company on my business card. Maybe I should do this on my own. And so when I do a $5,000 carpentry job, I don't get paid, $50 an hour, for the 10 hours that I'm here. Instead, I get the full $5,000. So if that was your arc and that's when you decided you were going to launch and you were going to become a carpenter, one of the things that can be tempting is to feel like the most important thing that you do in that business is the actual carpentry work. And maybe it is, especially initially, but over time it can't be, because the reason for being someone that owns a carpentry business is very different than the reasons for being someone who's an excellent carpenter. So anyway, so that was way more preamble than I think you were asking for. But so some of how you can help yourself with that. So one, and this is one that I use a lot, is to use a phrase from a guy named Peter Drucker, who's one of my all-time favorite business authors. He wrote a book, probably his most important book, is called The Effective Executive. And one, like, this is like a paraphrase of what he says there, but I think about this paraphrase all the time. He says, the executive's job is to determine what the most important thing is for them to do, and then to only do that thing. So first off, when you hear me say that, you might be like, well, I'm not an executive. Well, executive doesn't mean CEO, or it doesn't mean you don't become an executive once you have a certain number of people who work for you. You're an executive because it's your job to execute. So if you're someone who's got decision-making responsibility and you own the outcomes of those decisions, that means you're an executive, because in that scenario, it's your job to execute. So if you're an executive, if you're a business owner, you are for sure an executive. Even if you're a business owner who has a business with one employee and you are that one employee, you are an executive in that business. You're the only executive in that business, so it makes you incredibly important in that business. So again, I'm getting farther afield from the question, but if you think about that quote, okay, if I'm an executive, it's my job to determine what's the most important thing to do, and then it's my job to only do that thing. That's another way of saying I need to make sure that all of my resources, my time, my money, my mental energy, my creativity, that all of that is focused on the stuff that's the most important for this business. And if I'm not doing that, then I'm not doing my job. That's a really good thing to kind of like help reorient you to making sure that your priorities line up with your strategy, your strategic vision. That's a way to help you become a better strategic thinker. And that'll change over time. Strategy should change slowly, but it should change. And part of the reason why it changes slowly is because, just like we talked about, it's how you win the war. It's not how you win the battle, you know? So there's times in a real life war whenever, ground assault is more important than air assault, or your Navy is more important than your Air Force, or whatever. But the strategy that those things are all in service of might not change, whereas the tactics could change as the circumstances change. So that's one of the reasons why having that mental model of the Peter Drucker line can help a lot. Another thing that I think helps, that also relates to what we said about that toddler analogy in answer to your first question, is another mental shortcut that you can think about. So one of the things that I think really helps is to every once in a while ask myself, so let's say I have a question that I'm trying to answer, or a problem that I'm trying to solve, and if I'm like really laboring with it, or maybe I've even come to a solution and now I want to kind of test it to make sure I feel good about it. One of the ways I think about that is I'll think, if I can imagine a future where I'm not the boss anymore, and my kids or the people who are my current direct reports, none of them are the boss anymore either, because enough time has passed that those people have aged out of the business. They've retired, maybe they've even passed away. If I'm imagining this problem that I'm trying to solve, or this solution that I'm trying to find, and I think to myself, when I imagine this business at a point where no one that I have direct influence over right now is in the saddle and able to operate the business, what will this business look like if I make the decision that I'm about to make? And essentially what you're trying to do is you're trying to extend your focus. I talked about that idea in the answer to the first question about thinking about a destination that's so far away that it's over the horizon line. This is a similar sort of a concept. If I extend my focus to a future that's so far away that I'm not going to be able to have direct, or even indirect by secondary means, influence over that scenario. The only way I'll be able to influence that scenario is through the decision I'm about to make and all the other decisions I make. So if I use that, let's imagine a future that's so far away that neither me nor any of my direct reports are going to be able to be in that situation. Is the decision I'm about to make one that serves that future situation well and appropriately? And if it is, that probably means that decision is aligned with the grand strategy that I have for this business. So those would be the two mental models. Number one, what's the most important thing for me to do, and am I only doing that thing? Learning to ask myself that question all the time. Number two, every once in a while, taking the opportunity to reorient myself by thinking, in an imagined future that's so far away that I can't have direct control over it, will I help the organization by making the decision I'm about to make? By, what's the solution that will help that organization that exists so far into the future that I can't have direct or even secondary influence over it? So, does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.